Hi, I'm Bob Dorr, Chief Auditor at the AICPA, and joining you today to discuss some issues that we've been receiving a lot of questions about in this COVID-19 pandemic that we're going through. And that has to do with some remote auditing procedures and other matters related to inventory observations. Um, Clearly there are situations that we're experiencing and that seem to be becoming more and more common each day, where by law, we may not be able to go out to a client location and physically observe inventory like we've done in the past. And we have some year ends coming up here very quickly, March 31st, and probably extending out even to June 30th, where inventory observations may be very difficult to perform, particularly in circumstances where we're not permitted to be at a client location. Now, one of the overriding messages we have for you today is that actually our auditing standards do address directly physical observation of inventory. And of course, we need to comply with those standards. But what we'd like to talk about today are what principles are involved with those standards and some alternatives that we may have available to us for it being able to meet those standards. Just for reference purposes, if you want to look at the actual standards at some point, they're contained in the codification of our statements on auditing standards. They're found in AUC section 501, specifically paragraphs 11 and through 14 of that standard or that section, and then the application paragraphs that go along with it. So really, what are we talking about? Well, at a principles level, what are those requirements really driving at? And essentially, for any organization or business where inventory is material, the existence of that inventory is going to be a relevant assertion. And I think that in the vast majority of cases, historically, it's just been generally accepted that the way an auditor would test the existence of that inventory is to physically, in person, observe its counting. Of course, that generally accepted procedure that we've done for years and years and years has now been stood upon its head when we actually can't get to the client site to observe that inventory. But as I said, I just want to talk with you quickly today about some alternatives at our disposal. These alternatives, of course, all have pros and cons, but it's important to recognize that there are alternatives available to us. So I'm going to start first and foremost with some more basic alternatives that actually may be quite familiar to us as auditors because they are situations that we have experienced before. It's just that in today's environment, they're much, much more common. So the first one I want to talk about is a situation where we may be able to observe the inventory in person at a later date and then roll back the inventory balances to the year-end date. This may be a good alternative for you if you have a client who doesn't have looming deadlines to have its audit report submitted. And you could perhaps delay a physical inventory being taken and you attending that inventory a couple of months down the road or something like that, at which point you may be able to go back to the client location once the social distancing policies are relaxed, do the inventory counts as we've normally done, and then using subsequent sales and purchases subsequent to year end, actually rolling those balances back to the balance sheet date and thereby satisfying or obtaining the majority of our evidence necessary for existence of inventory through those procedures. Of course, something to think about with this is that we don't know how long these social distancing policies are going to be in place. And if it takes longer than we think, I guess we'll have to rethink this type of strategy. But it is something for you to think about. And it's not extraordinarily rare. We all may have been in situations before where we were actually engaged to do an audit subsequent to a client's year end. And and as such, were not able to observe their inventory count at year end, and maybe did something like this rollback alternative in those cases. So while rolling back inventory is one alternative, we can also take a look at another second alternative that also is not extremely rare to be done, and that's if your client utilizes a perpetual inventory system and does cycle counting as part of their controls over that perpetual inventory system. Of course, a cycle count procedure is where the client essentially on a periodic basis, a lot of times quarterly, will conduct their own test counts, but just of a portion of their inventory, and then they take those test counts and look at the perpetual inventory system, make the appropriate adjustments, and so on and so forth, things like that. While cycle counting doesn't involve performing one huge year-end wall-to-wall count, at least in most cases, if the auditor has been testing those controls in the past and relying on those controls to establish the existence of inventory, you actually may be able to go back to that last prior cycle count and be able to roll forward then from that point, again using sales transactions and purchase transactions in testing those during the interim period. So roll forward and roll back are two alternatives. The other alternatives that we've received a lot of questions about actually have to do with using video technology in our inventory observations. And for each one of those, there's either a live video feed or possibly a recorded video option, and I'll talk a little bit about those. But first of all, I think it's important, one of the questions we've gotten is whether or not it's even permissible under the auditing standards to not physically in person count inventory. And I just direct your attention to paragraphs 11 and 14 of AUC section 501, where those requirements exist. However, it's with a caveat that the counting should be done in person unless it is impracticable to do so. And then there's some application paragraphs, A34 and others, that talk about situations that may be under which it may be impracticable for the inventory to be counted in person. And one of those is a situation where the inventory is located in a location such that it may pose threats to the auditor's safety and health. We think it's a very reasonable interpretation that with coronavirus and COVID-19 these days, that certainly is putting an auditor's health and safety in jeopardy. So we believe a determination or interpretation that in-person attendance is impracticable is reasonable. So that brings us down then to, once we get past that, then what can we use in the way of video equipment to observe inventory? I'll just touch on a couple of examples here today. With respect to live video feeds, it's possible that inventory locations, warehouses especially, the client may actually have security cameras that can be remote controlled or operated that may be possibly used for these purposes. Other methods of using live inventory video remote feeds, they include using products like Skype or Zoom or some of these common products. Even in some circumstances, you may be able to stream video from GoPro cameras strapped to a hard hat or something like that in the inventory location. And that's very, very possible to do. One important thing is that, of course, anybody utilizing or operating these types of video, this type of video equipment or technology should be appropriately trained in its use and so on and so forth. But it's very possible to do. And in those circumstances, it's really a live video feed. So the auditor can direct whoever is operating the equipment to go wherever they want them to view the inventory, to count it, to open boxes, to check for dust on boxes for obsolescence, to pick it up and let the auditor look at it, so on and so forth. So that is a very viable method for alternative procedures if you're not able to attend inventory observation in person. A second video option has to do with a situation where perhaps there's client personnel that are recording the counting of inventory and then delivering a recorded video to the auditor. Now, this one is a little bit more skeptical about, simply because from a very pragmatic issue is the file size. For those types of files are extremely large, and they may need to be broken down into smaller bits and chunks to manage the file size. And in that case, of course, we've got concerns about the video starting and stopping, which leads questions around the authenticity and the integrity of the video itself. So a few more cons associated with that method of doing inventory observations. But in either case, whether it's live video feed where you're actually controlling what's going on in the other end, or the recorded option, it's extremely important that we're make sure that we've got evidence and thinking about the authenticity of the video feed and how we go about that. One aspect that we've been challenged with recorded videos is making sure that it's actually the client location and it's actually the date and the time that it's purported to be. As we've had different options mentioned to us, like having a video recorded of the today's newspaper, what the headlines were, things like that, which harken back to some of the old days, or not old days, but some of the action drama or mystery movies we have with a kidnapping involved, and showing a newspaper to make sure that there's evidence that someone was alive on that date. Same concept holds here, and something to be thinking about with respect to that. So in connection with those video recordings, another aspect that we need to be concerned about, of course, is who is holding and operating that video equipment at the client's location. It's important that we have someone operating that equipment that's as disconnected from the functions of either accounting for, recording inventory, or even working in the warehouse, physically handling shipments or receipts of inventory, things like that. So in some of our larger organizations, some businesses out there, they may have an internal audit department or something like that. It would be probably good to have someone like that operate the equipment. If there's no internal audit department, a smaller organization like we have for many of our clients, just finding somebody that's got some degree of objectivity and not direct connection to inventory accounting or possession would be a good choice in that regard. Now, I'd also just like to close today with a couple of thoughts also. Don't forget that we do obtain audit evidence with respect to the existence assertion of inventory from other normal audit procedures we perform. For example, almost always there's some sort of price testing that's involved to evaluate the valuation assertion for inventory on our audits. And of course, when we're doing price testing, although not the main objective, we are looking at the quantity of inventory in stock at a particular point in time, as well as purchase prices and shipment data and things like that. So that gives us some indirect evidence. Other things that we do, we often test subsequent sales prices for valuation purposes, write-downs. We look at obsolescence information, things like that. So there are other procedures that we perform on inventory that do lend some evidence to the existence assertion, although certainly those other procedures wouldn't likely on their own be able to yield sufficient appropriate audit evidence for purposes of the existence assertion related to inventory when it's material. Nevertheless, we do need to realize that if we're in a situation where none of these alternatives seem viable or are going to work, so rollback doesn't work, roll forward won't work, we're not able to do some sort of video observation, whether live feed or recorded, we do need to recognize that in those situations when inventory is material, we may very well be looking at a scope limitation. And if material, of course, that would probably lead to a qualified opinion with respect to the audited financial statements. And we just need to be aware of those. We hope these alternatives will provide us with an opportunity to think creatively about how to do our audits this year. Really, the bottom line is that these are very challenging times, and we value and we respect your role as auditors that you play in the times that we're experiencing. And with respect to observing inventory on site, we just want you to realize that there are ways for auditors to be able to obtain sufficient, appropriate evidence about the existence of inventory that will allow you to perform a successful and high quality audit. So with that, I thank you for spending a few minutes with me today to run through this. We hope it's been helpful, and we'll be speaking to you again soon. Thank you.